Hey guys, this is Corbin Hostler back, and this week we have my favorite deck, Merfolk, which we have to record. I've been putting it off, but after Simon Slutsky won Grand Prix Los Angeles last weekend with this deck, there's just no way I couldn't play it. So, if you'll notice, actually, the last couple weeks I've been teasing you with one Merfolk card up here in this top searchable pane. Just a little Easter egg nobody caught on to yet, but this week it's finally here. A little backstory: this is the deck I know best in Modern. I've played this deck since the moment Modern existed. I literally, they announced Modern at midnight or whatever, and at 12:01 had my list together. I played this the first time in my life back in 2011 at a Star City Open. A friend loaned it to me in Legacy. I had never played Legacy before. I spent all day asking my opponents what their dual lands did, what colors they made. Tundra, what's that one? But nonetheless, I actually top 8'd with the deck. I split the finals with the deck, and then I top 16 an Invitational later with it. So this is sort of my baby, and now I have it in Modern. I have it full out. I've played this deck forever. I love it. So in honor of Simon winning, I figured we had to give it a shot here. So let's walk through my list and see what we have here. I'll start with the lands. 3 Cavernous Souls. This is great for getting around counter spells. There's a lot more blue decks now, especially with Ancestral Vision being unbanned. So being able to make your guys uncounterable is actually a big game because it means between that and Aetherfall, you have 7 ways to blank remands and mana leaks. And that can be really important. You can randomly strand, 1 to 2 dead cards in a Jeskai opponent's hand every game 1 at least, and sometimes more. And that can be very good. 12 islands, the normal. Minamo and Obero, these mainly exist to protect against Choke, which is the islands don't untap enchantment that green decks can play, and it can wreck you pretty hard. I actually don't think it's great against Merfolk because we have enough ways around it with Aether Files as well, but it is something to be concerned about, and that's why we play these. Now, there's also some side benefits to these. Obero, for instance, can bounce itself back to your hand, which is good in response to a Raven's Crime or Liliana the Veil activation. And Minamo, this one doesn't come up very often, but you can untap a legendary permanent, which in this deck, as we'll get to later, is Thassa. It could also be Kira, I guess, in a situation where that might be relevant. It's unlikely. 3 Mutavaults. I know most lists run 4, and I'm not going to say that running 4 is wrong. However, I place having blue mana extremely highly on my list, especially as we're running the Vapor Snags here instead of multiple Dismembers because of the life loss aspect. So you want that blue mana. Vapor Snag can also save your own creatures, which Dismember cannot. And after sideboarding, you get a bunch of Spell Pierces and Swan Songs and things that you really need this blue mana for on turn 3. So there's actually a lot of games where you want 3 blue mana on turn 3. So it's very important to have, I think, as many blue sources as possible. And Cavern counts because you can use it to cast that Merfolk, but Mutavault does not. So after that, sort of the parts that are very common, for Curse Catcher. Is great against the combo matchups, against just protecting your guys against removal. Silvergill is the best card in the deck. Draws you a card, attacks, beats down, only costs 1 blue mana. In my opinion, Merfolk wouldn't even exist without this card. Harbinger of the Tides, this is the new edition that Simon actually did not play, but I think it's still reasonable. Most lists you see do play some number of this card. Can tap their creatures, you can do it on their turn, it combos very well with Marrow Regery, etc., etc. It's just a really great tempo play. Then, of course, the 8 main lords: Lord of Atlantis, Master of the Pearl Train. Pump all your other Merfolk, give you lots of devotion to blue for Master of Waves and Thassa, and, of course, give them Island Walk. And then that's, this is sort of, and I say the deck couldn't exist without Silvergill, but really these are the reason the deck was ever even put together in the first place, was Lord of Atlantis. So moving on, Marrow Regery, this is sort of the one that it looks different because it's 3 mana and that's not ideal, but you can do so many things with this. It's much better than something like Merfolk Sovereign, which is just sort of a generic 3 mana lord. With this, you can untap your lands and sort of chain out your hand. A lot of times you can untap Aether Vial, you can tap down their creatures. If they have an untapped creature, you can cast Harbinger of the Tides, use the Marrow Regery trigger to tap it down, and then use the Harbinger trigger to bounce it. So you can just, sort of poop on, their blockers that way. The Dismember sort of combo with the Vapor Snags, and depending on your meta and the decks you expect to play, and sort of just how you want to play, you can run more Dismember, less Vapor Snag, more Spell Pierce, etc. in the main deck. 4 Master of Waves, because he's basically just the truth. You play this card, get a couple tokens, and it'll just win games a lot of the times. It can solo Jund a lot of the time because basically only Maelstrom Pulse in their deck answers it. Then some of the others. So Monastery Siege, I actually run one in paper, but online Kira is bugged, so the Kira ability, last I heard, does not work. So Monastery Siege, you can choose the Dragons mode, and it sort of fills that role. It can't be Aether Vial in, it's not a creature, obviously, which can be a good thing. It means it doesn't die to a Pyroclasm or an Anger of the Gods. It also has the upside that, unlike Kira, which sort of just gets, its pants pulled down by an Abrupt Decay, because Abrupt Decay gets to ignore the ability on Kira, Monastery Siege makes that Abrupt Decay cost more in the first place, so they don't even have, the opportunity to sort of get around it. And that's actually very good. And sort of the secret mode on this card, I guess, is the cons mode, where it's not a loot. You draw 2 and then discard 1. And a lot of times, if I draw it in the mid game or something against a control deck and both players have a lot of mana, I'll actually choose the cons mode, because you draw between this and Thassa and, sort of your other value spells like Silvergill and Spreading Seas, you can just go longer than your opponent. You can play the late game better than them by ensuring that you always have better draws. And while this isn't card advantage, it's incredible card selection. And when you have a deck with Aether Vials and lands that you don't want to draw late, this actually just does, overtime. It's really, really good in that one-of spot. Let's talk about Thassa. Thassa is another one that you don't necessarily see a lot, but I love this card. I think it does everything we want it to do. The fact that it's an indestructible creature, of course, that does come up sometimes. And sometimes people say, oh, well, it's a win more, because if you have 5 devotion, then you're probably already winning the game. And I don't think that's necessarily true, because a lot of board states get where maybe you have a Spreading Seas in play, and maybe you have a Monastery Siege, or just 2 Spreading Seas and a Curse Catcher. And that's not a good board. That's 3 devotion. It's not great. And maybe Thassa's your 4th devotion. And no, it's not a creature. But I wouldn't say that you're winning that game. Maybe your board is just Curse Catcher, Spreading Seas, Thassa, and that's not very good. That's not a position that would be one more. So, and then what it does, though, is it allows any draw off the top of our deck, like all of these Lords and Harbingers and these, the 11 double blue cards we run, that all of a sudden take your board from being, not very good to just killing them. You make this a 5/5. You get in with it, and that's not a win more position. That's just a great card, and you're more likely to find these because you're scrying every turn. I love seeing this card against Jund. I love seeing it against Control. You just get to scry away all your dead draws and outvalue their draw step. And I think one of the mistakes a lot of Merfolk players make is being afraid to play the long game. They don't want to go late. They just think they need to turbo out their opponents. And I don't think that's true. I think Merfolk is well suited to play the long game with the Spreading Seas, with the Silvergills, and with these other cards. So I love this card. And the fact that you can give yourself unblockable is sometimes very relevant. All right, so let's move on to the sideboard here. Spell Piercers and Swan Songs, these are my go-to for combo matchups. I think that they're where you want to be. You really want 1 mana counter spells in this deck, not 2 mana counter spells, because basically turn 3 is the turn you always want to counter something, and you have a million 2-drops in your deck, so you're probably playing a 2-drop, and you still want to counter something. And if you have Remand or Mana Leak or Negate or anything like that, that doesn't work. I think Spell Pierce, does that job very well, and Swan Song is great against stuff like Scape Shift and Ad Nauseam and things like that, where you just really need a hard counter. After that, we have the Hurkyl's Recalls for the, really unwinnable Affinity matchup, though Simon did beat it in the finals, which was awesome to watch on the back of Hurkyl's Recall. But it also has some value against other decks. Eggs is a thing that occasionally pops up on Magic Online. Maybe the Thopter Foundry decks, if they're really heavy on artifacts. Etc. It's just a thing that sometimes is very good, but mainly Affinity. Same with Chalice of the Void. It has some fringe uses against, in fact, you want to play it against on 1, living in, you want to play it on 0. I think that you could sometimes, I don't really bring it in against Burn, but you could bring it in against Burn, try to get on 1. But it's also very good on the play for 0 against Affinity, because you get their Mox Opals and their Memnites. And it actually can really mess up their game plan a lot of the times, but it's only good on the play there, obviously. After that, Tidebinders and Hibernation. Hibernation for the sort of the green decks that swarm you, the Melirapods and the Elves and so on. And then Tidebinder Mage for the burn. And you can bring it in against Jund if you want. You obviously bring it in against the Zoo decks, etc. Another Dismember for Infect and whatever random decks where you just want to kill something, bringing it against Jund over the second Vapor Snag. Relics for additional graveyard hate and against Snapcaster decks. And then this is the last card. It's pretty saucy, I think. Scab Ruinator. You look at it and you're like, why is this here? But in practice, it actually is really great. If you're playing against a deck with Wrath of God in it, one, sometimes you can just, board this, you can vial this thing in on 3 and just get to go to town. And that's just a 5/6, it's huge, it'll be the biggest thing on the board. Most of the time bigger than Tarmogoyf at that point in the game. And that's great. Sure. But the main reason we play it then is if our opponent wraths us, all of a sudden we just cast it out of our graveyard. I don't usually bring it in against Jund, but I always bring it in against the Snapcaster Wrath decks. And it's like they're 1-for-1. The Jeskai will, maybe Mana Leak a guy if they're lucky and bolt 2 of them, whatever. And then all of a sudden you just get to play this 5/6 flyer that they have to have Path to Exile for, or they have to double bolt it. They can't get away with Snapcaster bolting this thing or helixing it or whatever. It's really good there. So the only anti-synergy, I guess, with it is that you bring in the relics, but most of the time you can play, against the Snapcaster decks, you can usually just tap this once a turn. You don't actually have to pop it all that often, so you're not even hurting yourself. But in the situations where it does come up, you can obviously plan around it to an extent. So, this is certainly not a card you have to have, but especially with the Jeskai Nahiri decks being a little more popular, I actually really like this thing as another late game tool that is just going to be very huge. So that's the deck. Now I'm going to try to explain some of the lines of play, of course, as we go. So here comes some video.